Red Nails by Robert E. Howard. Part 2. Chapter 2 continued by the blaze of the fire jewels. She killed the first who came within reach before he could strike a blow, her long straight blade splitting his skull even as his own sword lifted for a stroke. She sidestepped a thrust even as she parried a slash. Her eyes danced and her lips smiled without mercy. Again she was Valeria of the Red Brotherhood, and the hum of her steel was like a bridal song in her ears. Her sword darted past the blade that sought to parry, and sheathed 6 inches of its point in a leather-guarded midriff. The man gasped agonizedly and went to his knees, but his tall mate lunged in ferocious silence, raining blow on blow so furiously that Valeria had no opportunity to counter. She stepped back coolly, parrying the strokes and watching for her chance to thrust home. He could not long keep up that flailing whirlwind. His arm would tire, his wind would fail, he would weaken, falter, and then her blade would slide smoothly into his heart. A sidelong glance showed her Teotl kneeling on the breast of his antagonist and striving to break the other's hold on his wrist and to drive home a dagger. Sweat beaded the forehead of the man facing her, and his eyes were like burning coals. Smite as he would, he could not break past nor beat down her guard. His breath came in gusty gulps, his blows began to fall erratically. She stepped back to draw him out, and felt her thighs locked in an iron grip. She had forgotten the wounded man on the floor. Crouching on his knees, he held her with both arms locked about her legs, and his mate croaked in triumph and began working his way around to come at her from the left side. Valeria wrenched and tore savagely, but in vain. She could free herself of this clinging menace with a downward flick of her sword, but in that instant the curved blade of the tall warrior would crash through her skull. The wounded man began to worry at her bare thigh with his teeth like a wild beast. She reached down with her left hand and gripped his long hair, forcing his head back so that his white teeth and rolling eyes gleamed up at her. The tall Xotalanc cried out fiercely and leaped in, smiting with all the fury of his arm. Awkwardly she parried the stroke, and it beat the flat of her blade down on her head so that she saw sparks flash before her eyes, and staggered. Up went the sword again with a low beast-like cry of triumph, and then a giant form loomed behind the Xotalanc, and steel flashed like a jet of blue lightning. The cry of the warrior broke short, and he went down like an ox beneath the poleaxe, his brains gushing from his skull that had been split to the throat. "Conan!" gasped Valeria. In a gust of passion she turned on the Xotalanc, whose long hair she still gripped in her left hand. "Dog of hell!" Her blade swished as it cut the air in an upswinging arc with a blur in the middle, and the headless body slumped down, spurting blood. She hurled the severed head across the room. "What the devil's going on here?" Conan bestrode the corpse of the man he had killed, broadsword in hand, glaring about him in amazement. Teotl was rising from the twitching figure of the last Xotalanc, shaking red drops from his dagger. He was bleeding from the stab deep in the thigh. He stared at Conan with dilated eyes. "What is all this?" Conan demanded again, not yet recovered from the stunning surprise of finding Valeria engaged in a savage battle with fantastic figures in a city he had thought empty and uninhabited. Returning from an aimless exploration of the upper chambers to find Valeria missing from the room where he had left her, He had followed the sound of strife that burst on his dumbfounded ears. "5 dead dogs!" exclaimed Tehotl, his flaming eyes reflecting a ghastly exultation. "5 slain! 5 crimson nails for the Black Pillar! The gods of blood be thanked!" He lifted quivering hands on high, and then, with the face of a fiend, he spat on the corpses and stamped on their faces, dancing in his ghoulish glee. His recent allies eyed him in amazement, and Conan asked in the Aquilonian tongue, "Who is this madman?" Valeria shrugged her shoulders. "He says his name's Tehotl. From his babblings I gather that his people live at one end of this crazy city, and these others at the other end. Maybe we better go with him. He seems friendly, and it's easy to see that the other clan isn't." Tehotl had ceased his dancing and was listening again, his head tilted sidewise, dog-like, triumph struggling with fear in his repellent countenance. "Come away now," he whispered. "We have done enough. 5 dead dogs. My people will welcome you. They will honor you. But come, it is far to Tehotli. At one moment the Xotalangs may come on us in numbers, too great even for your swords." "Lead the way," grunted Conan. Tehotl instantly mounted a stair leading up to the gallery, beckoning them to follow him, which they did, moving rapidly to keep on his heels. Having reached the gallery, he plunged into a door that opened toward the west and hurried through chamber after chamber, each lighted by skylights or green fire jewels. "What sort of place can this be?" muttered Valeria under her breath. "Grum knows," answered Conan. "I've seen his kind before, though. They live on the shores of Lake Zuad, near the border of Kush. They're a sort of mongrel Stygians, mixed with another race that wandered into Stygia from the east some centuries ago and were absorbed by them. They're called Tlazitlans. I'm willing to bet it wasn't they who built this city, though." Tehotl's fear did not seem to diminish as they drew away from the chamber where the dead man lay. He kept twisting his head on his shoulder to listen for sounds of pursuit, and stared with burning intensity into every doorway they passed. Valeria shivered in spite of herself. She feared no man, but the weird floor beneath her feet, the uncanny jewels over her head, dividing the lurking shadows among them, the stealth and terror of their guide, impressed her with a nameless apprehension, a sensation of lurking inhuman peril. "They may be between us and Tehotli," he whispered once. "We must beware lest they be lying in wait." "Why don't we get out of this infernal palace and take to the streets?" demanded Valeria. "There are no streets in Tehotl," he answered. "No squares nor open courts. The whole city is built like one giant palace under one roof. The nearest approach to a street is the Great Hall, which traverses the city from the north gate to the south gate. The only doors opening into the outer world are the city gates, through which no living man has passed for 50 years. "How long have you dwelt here?" asked Conan. "I was born in the castle of Tehotli 35 years ago. I have never set foot outside the city. For the love of gods, let us go silently. These halls may be full of lurking devils. Olmec shall tell you all when we reach Tehotli." So in silence they glided on, with the green firestones blinking overhead as the flaming floor smoldering under their feet, and it seemed to Valeria as if they fled through hell, guided by a dark-faced, lank-haired goblin. Yet it was Conan who halted them as they were crossing an unusually wide chamber. His wilderness-bred ears were keener even than the ears of Tehotl, whetted though these were by a lifetime of warfare in these silent corridors. "You think some of your enemies may be ahead of us, lying in ambush? "They prowl through these rooms at all hours," answered Teotl, "as do we. The halls and chambers between Tecuhtli and Xotalanc are a disputed region, owned by no man. We call it the Halls of Silence. Why, do you ask?" "Because men are in the chambers ahead of us," answered Conan. "I heard steel clink against stone." Again a shaking seized Teotl, and he clenched his teeth to keep them from chattering. "Perhaps they are your friends?" suggested Valeria. "We dare not chance it." He panted and moved with frenzied activity. He turned aside and glided through a doorway on the left, which led into a chamber from which an ivory staircase wound down into darkness. "This leads to an unlighted corridor below us," he hissed, great beads of perspiration standing out on his brow. "They may be lurking there too. It may all be a trick to draw us into it. But we must take the chance that they have laid their ambush in the rooms above. Come swiftly now." Softly as phantoms they descended the stair and came to the mouth of a corridor black as night. They crouched there for a moment, listening, and then melted into it. As they moved along, Valerius's flesh crawled between her shoulders in momentary expectation of a sword thrust in the dark. But for Conan's iron fingers gripping her arm, she had no physical cognizance of her companions. Neither made as much noise as a cat would have made. The darkness was absolute. One hand outstretched touched a wall, and occasionally she felt the door under her fingers. The hallway seemed interminable. Suddenly they were galvanized by a sound behind them. Valerius's flesh crawled anew, for she recognized it as the soft opening of a door. Men had come into the corridor behind them. Even with the thought she stumbled over something that felt like a human skull. It rolled across the floor with an appalling clatter. "Run!" yelped Teotl, a note of hysteria in his voice, and was away down the corridor like a flying ghost. Again Valeria felt Conan's hand bearing her up and sweeping her along as they raced after their guide. Conan could see in the dark no better than she, but he possessed a sort of instinct that made his course unerring. Without his support and guidance, she would have fallen or stumbled against the wall. Down the corridor they sped, while the swift patter of flying feet drew closer and closer, and then, suddenly, Teotl panted, "Here is the stair! After me! Quick! Oh, quick!" His hand came out of the dark and caught Valerius's wrist as she stumbled blindly on the steps. She felt herself half dragged, half lifted up the winding stair, while Conan released her and turned on the steps, his ears and instincts telling him their foes were hard at their backs, and the sound were not all those of human feet. Something came writhing up the steps, something that slithered and rustled and brought a chill in the air with it. Conan lashed down with his great sword and felt the blade shear through something that might have been flesh and bone, and cut deep into the stair beneath. Something touched his foot that chilled like the touch of frost, and then the darkness beneath him was disturbed by a frightful threshing and lashing, and a man cried out in agony. The next moment, Conan was racing up the winding staircase and through a door that stood open at the head. Valeria and Teotl were already through, and Teotl slammed the door and shot a bolt across it, the first Conan had seen since they had left the outer gate. Then he turned and ran across the well-lighted chamber into which they had come, and as they passed through the farther door, Conan glanced back and saw the door groaning and straining under heavy pressure violently applied from the other side. Though Teotl did not abate either his speed or his caution, he seemed more confident now. He had the air of a man who had come into familiar territory, within call of friends. But Conan renewed his terror by asking, "What was that thing I fought on the stairs?" "The men of Xatalanc," answered Teotl without looking back. "I told you the halls were full of them." "This wasn't a man," grunted Conan. "It was something that crawled, and it was as cold as ice to the touch. I think I cut it asunder. It fell back on the men who were following us, and must have killed one of them in its death throes." Teotl's head jerked back, his face ashy again. Convulsively, he quickened his pace. "It was the Crawler, a monster they have brought out of the catacombs to aid them. What it is, we do not know, but we have found our people hideously slain by it. In Set's name, hasten. If they put it on our trail, it will follow us to the very doors of Tecuhtli." "I doubt it," grunted Conan. "That was a shrewd cut. I dealt it on the stair." "Hasten, hasten," groaned Teotl. They ran through a series of green-lit chambers, traversed a broad hall, and halted before a giant bronze door. Teotl said, "This is Tecuhtli." Chapter 3. The People of the Feud. Teotl smote on the bronze door with his clenched hand, and then turned sidewise so that he could watch back along the hall. "Men have been smitten down before this door when they thought they were safe," he said. "Why don't they open the door?" asked Conan. "They are looking at us through the eye," answered Teotl. "They are puzzled at the sight of you." He lifted his voice and called, "Open the door, Excalan! It is I, Teotl, with friends from the great world beyond the forest. They will open," he assured his allies. "They better do it in a hurry then," said Conan grimly. "I hear something crawling along the floor beyond the hall." Teotl went ashy again and attacked the door with his fists, screaming, "Open, you fools! Open! The Crawler is at our heels!" Even as he beat and shouted, the great bronze door swung noiselessly back, revealing a heavy chain across the entrance, over which spearheads bristled and fierce countenances regarded them intently for an instant. Then the chain was dropped, and Teotl grasped the arms of his friends in a nervous frenzy, and fairly dragged them over the threshold. A glance over his shoulder, just as the door was closing, showed Conan the long dim vista of the hall, and dimly framed at the other end an Ophidian shape that writhed slowly and painfully into view, flowing in a dull-hued length from a chamber door, its hideous blood-stained head wagging drunkenly. Then the closing door shut off his view. Inside the square chamber into which they had come, heavy bolts were drawn across the floor, and the chain locked into place. The door was made to stand the battering of a siege. 4 men stood on guard, of the same lank-haired, dark-skinned breed as Teotl, with spears in their hands and sword at their hips. In the wall near the door there was a complicated contrivance of mirrors, which Conan guessed was the eye Teotl had mentioned, so arranged that a narrow, crystal-paned slot in the wall could be looked through from within without being discernible from without. The 4 guardsmen stared at the strangers with wonder, but asked no question, nor did Teotl vouchsafe any information. He moved with easy confidence now, as if he had shed his cloak of indecision and fear the instant he crossed the threshold. "Come!" he urged his new-found friends, but Conan glanced towards the door. "What about those fellows who were following us? Won't they try to storm that door?" Teotl shook his head. "They know they cannot break down the door of the Eagle. They will flee back to Xatalanc with their crawling fiend. Come, I will take you to the rulers of Tecuhtli." One of the 4 guards opened a door opposite the one by which they had entered, and they passed through into a hallway which, like most of the rooms on that level, was lighted by both the slot-light skylights and the clusters of winking fire gems. But unlike the other rooms they had traversed, this hall showed evidence of occupation. Velvet tapestries adorned the glossy jade walls, rich rugs were on the crimson floors, and the ivory seats, benches and divans were littered with satin cushions. The hall ended in an ornate door before which stood no guard. Without ceremony, Teotl thrust the door open and ushered his friends into a broad chamber, where some 30 dark-skinned men and women lounged on satin-covered couches and sprang up with exclamations of amazement. The men, all except one, were of the same type as Teotl, and the women were equally dark and strange-eyed, though not unbeautiful in a weird, dark way. They wore sandals, golden breastplates and scanty silk skirts supported by gem-crusted girdles, and their black manes, cut square at their naked shoulders, were bound with silver circlets. On a wide ivory seat on a jade dais sat a man and a woman who differed subtly from the others. He was a giant with an enormous sweep of breast and the shoulders of a bull. Unlike the others, he was bearded with a thick blue-black beard which fell almost to his broad girdle. He wore a robe of purple silk which reflected changing sheens of color with every movement, and one wide sleeve drawn back to his elbow revealed a forearm massive with corded muscles. The band which confined his blue-black locks was set with glittering jewels. The woman beside him sprang to her feet with a startled exclamation as the strangers entered, and her eyes, passing over Conan, fixed themselves with burning intensity on Valeria. She was tall and lithe, by far the most beautiful woman in the room. She was clad more scantily even than the others, for instead of a skirt, she wore merely a broad strip of gilt-worked purple cloth faced into the middle of her girdle which fell below her knees. Another strip at the back of her girdle completed that part of her costume, which she wore with a cynical indifference. Her breastplates and the circlet about her temples were adorned with gems. In her eyes alone, of all the dark-skinned people there lurked no brooding gleam of madness. She spoke no word after her first exclamation. She stood tensely, her hands clenched, staring at Valeria. "Prince Olmec," spoke Teotl, bowing low, with arms outspread and the palms of his hands turned upward. "I bring allies from the world beyond the forest. In the chamber of Tezcoti, the burning skull slew Chikmek, my companion." "The burning skull!" It was a shuddering whisper of fear from the people of Tecuhtli. "Aye, then came I and found Chikmek lying with his throat cut. Before I could flee, the burning skull came upon me, and when I looked upon it, my blood became as ice, and the marrow of my bones melted. I could neither fight nor run. I could only await the stroke. Then came this white-skinned woman and struck him down with her sword. And lo, it was only a dog of Xotalanc with white paint upon his skin, and the living skull of an ancient wizard upon his head. Now that skull lies in many pieces, and the dog who wore it is a dead man." An indescribably fierce exultation edged the last sentence and was echoed in the low, savage exclamations from the crowding listeners. "But wait!" exclaimed Teotl. "There is more. While I talk with the woman, 4 Xotalancs came upon us. One I slew. There is the stab in my thigh to prove how desperate was the fight. 2 the woman killed, but we were hard pressed when this man came into the fray and split the skull of the 4th. Aye, 5 crimson nails there are to be driven into the pillar of vengeance." He pointed to a black column of ebony which stood behind the dais. Hundreds of red dots scarred its polished surface, the bright scarlet heads of heavy copper nails driven into the black wood.
5 red nails for 5 Xotalanca lives!
Exulted Teotl, and the horrible exultation in the faces of the listeners made them inhuman. "Who are these people?" asked Olmec, and his voice was like the low, deep rumble of a distant bull. None of the people of Xuchotl spoke loudly. It was as if they had absorbed into their souls the silence of the empty halls and deserted chambers.
"I am Conan, a Cimmerian,"
answered the barbarian briefly.
"This woman is Valeria of the Red Brotherhood, an Aquilonian pirate. We are deserters from an army on the Darfar border, far to the north, and are trying to reach the coast."
The woman on the dais spoke loudly, her words tripping in her haste.
"You can never reach the coast. There is no escape from Xuchotl. You will spend the rest of your lives in this city."
"What do you mean?"
growled Conan, clapping his hand to his hilt and stepping about so as to face both the dais and the rest of the room.
"Are you telling us we're prisoners?"
"She did not mean that," interposed Olmec. "We are your friends. We would not restrain you against your will. But I fear other circumstances will make it impossible for you to leave Xuchotl." His eyes flickered to Valeria, and he lowered them quickly. "This woman is Tashkela," he said. "She is a princess of Teotli. But let food and drink be brought to our guests. Doubtless they are hungry and weary from their long travels." He indicated an ivory table, and after an exchange of glances, the adventurers seated themselves. The Cimmerian was suspicious. His fierce blue eyes roved about the chamber, and he kept his sword close to his hand. But an invitation to eat and drink never found him backward. His eyes kept wandering to Tashkela, but the princess had eyes only for his white-skinned companion. Teotl, who had bound a strip of silk about his wounded thigh, placed himself at the table to attend to the wants of his friends, seeming to consider it a privilege and honor to see after their needs. He inspected the food and drink the others brought in gold vessels and dishes, and tasted each before he placed it before his guests. While they ate, Olmec sat in silence on his ivory seat, watching them from under his broad black brows. Tashkela sat beside him, chin cupped in her hands and her elbows resting on her knees. Her dark, enigmatic eyes, burning with a mysterious light, never left Valerius's supple figure. Behind her seat, a sullen, handsome girl waved an ostrich plume fan with a slow rhythm. The food was fruit of an exotic kind, unfamiliar to the wanderers, but very palatable, and the drink was a light crimson wine that carried a heady tang. "You have come from afar," said Olmec at last. "I have read the books of our fathers. Aquilonia lies beyond the lands of the Stygians and the Shemites, beyond Argos and Zingara, and Cimmeria lies beyond Aquilonia."
"We have each a roving foot,"
answered Conan carelessly. "How you won through the forest is a wonder to me," quoth Olmec. "In bygone days, 1,000 fighting men scarcely were able to carve a road through its perils."
"We encountered a bench-legged monstrosity, about the size of a mastodon,"
said Conan casually, holding out his wine goblet, which Teotl filled with evident pleasure.
"But when we'd killed it, we had no further trouble."
The wine vessel slipped from Teotl's hand to crash on the floor. His dusky skin went ashy. Olmec started to his feet, an image of stunned amazement, and a low gasp of awe or terror breathed up from the others. Some slipped to their knees as if their legs would not support them. Only Tashkela seemed not to have heard. Conan glared about him bewilderedly.
What's the matter? What are you gaping about?
You slew the dragon god.
God? I killed a dragon. Why not? It was trying to gobble us up.
But dragons are immortal, exclaimed Olmec. They slay each other, but no man ever killed a dragon. The 1,000 fighting men of our ancestors who fought their way to Zuhotl could not prevail against them. Their swords broke like twigs against their scales.
If your ancestors had thought to dip their spears in the poisonous juice of their Cetas's apples,
quoth Conan with his mouth full,
and jabbed them in the eyes or mouth or somewhere like that, they'd have seen that dragons are no more immortal than any other chunk of beef. The carcass lies at the edge of the trees, just within the forest. If you don't believe me, go and look for yourself.
Olmec shook his head, not in disbelief, but in wonder. It was because of the dragons that our ancestors took refuge in Zuhotl, said he. They dared not pass through the plain and plunge into the forest beyond. Scores of them were seized and devoured by the monsters before they could reach the city.
Then your ancestors didn't build Zuhotl?
Asked Valeria. It was ancient when they first came into the land. How long it had stood here, not even its degenerate inhabitants knew.
Your people came from Lake Zuad?
Questioned Conan. Aye, more than half a century ago, a tribe of the Tlazitlans rebelled against the Stygian king, and being defeated in battle fled southward. For many weeks they wandered over grasslands, deserts and hills, and at last they came into the great forest, 1,000 fighting men with their women and children. It was in the forest that the dragons fell upon them and tore many to pieces. So the people fled in a frenzy of fear before them, and at last came into the plain and saw the city of Zuhotl in the midst of it. They camped before the city, not daring to leave the plain, for the night was made hideous with the noise of the battling monsters through the forest. They made war incessantly upon one another, yet they came not into the plain. The people of the city shut their gates and shot arrows at our people from the walls. The Tlazitlans were imprisoned on the plain, as if the ring of the forest had been a great wall, for to venture into the woods would have been madness. That night there came secretly to their camp a slave from the city, one of their own blood, who with a band of exploring soldiers had wandered into the forest long before, when he was a young man. The dragons had devoured all his companions, but he had been taken into the city to dwell in servitude. His name was Tolkemek. A flame lighted the dark eyes at mention of the name, and some of the people muttered obscenely and spat. He promised to open the gates to the warriors. He asked only that all captives taken be delivered into his hands. At dawn he opened the gates. The warriors swarmed in, and the halls of Zuhotl ran red. Only a few hundred folk dwelt there, decaying remnants of a once great race. Tolkemek said they came from the east long ago, from old Kosala, when the ancestors of those who now dwell in Kosala came up from the south and drove forth the original inhabitants of the land. They wandered far westward and finally found this forest-girdled plain, inhabited then by a tribe of black people. These they enslaved and set to building a city. From the hills to the east they brought jade and marble and lapis lazuli and gold, silver and copper. Herds of elephants provided them with ivory. When their city was completed, they slew all the black slaves. And their magicians made a terrible magic to guard the city, for by their necromantic arts they recreated the dragons which had once dwelt in this lost land, and whose monstrous bones they found in the forest. Those bones they clothed in flesh and life, and the living beasts walked the earth as they walked it when time was young. But the wizards wove a spell that kept them in the forest, and they came not into the plain. So for many centuries the people of Zuchotl dwelt in their city, cultivating the fertile plain, until their wise men learned how to grow fruit within the city, fruit which is not planted in soil, but obtains its nourishment out of the air. And then they let the irrigation ditches run dry, and dwelt more and more in luxurious sloth, until decay seized them. They were a dying race when our ancestors broke through the forest and came into the plain. Their wizards had died, and the people had forgot their ancient necromancy. They could fight neither by sorcery nor the sword. Well, our fathers slew the people of Zuchotl, all except 100, which were given living into the hands of Tolkemec, who had been their slave, and for many days and nights the halls re-echoed to their screams under the agony of his tortures. So the Tlazitlans dwelt here for a while in peace, ruled by the brothers Techutli and Xotalanc, and by Tolkemec. Tolkemec took a girl of the tribe to wife, and because he had opened the gates, and because he knew many of the arts of the Zuchotlans, he shared the rule of the tribe with the brothers who had led the rebellion and the flight. For a few years then they dwelt at peace within the city, doing little but eating, drinking, and making love, and raising children. There was no necessity to till the plain, for Tolkemec taught them how to cultivate the air-devouring fruits. Besides, the slaying of the Zuchotlans broke the spell that held the dragons in the forest, and they came nightly and bellowed about the gates of the city. The plain ran red with the blood of their eternal warfare, and it was then that he bit his tongue in the midst of the sentence, then presently continued. But Valeria and Conan felt that he had checked an admission he had considered unwise. 5 years they dwelt in peace. Then Olmex's eyes rested briefly on the silent woman at his side. Xotalanc took a woman to wife, a woman whom both Techutli and old Tolkemec desired. In his madness, Techutli stole her from her husband. Aye, she went willingly enough. Tolkemec, to spite Xotalanc, aided Techutli. Xotalanc demanded that she be given back to him, and the council of the tribe decided that the matter should be left to the woman. She chose to remain with Techutli. In wrath, Xotalanc sought to take her back by force, and the retainers of the brothers came to blows in the great hall. There was much bitterness. Blood was shed on both sides. The quarrel became a feud, the feud an open war. From the welter 3 factions emerged: Techutli, Xotalanc, and Tolkemec. Already in the days of peace they had divided the city between them. Techutli dwelt in the western quarter of the city, Xotalanc in the eastern, and Tolkemec with his family by the southern gate. Anger and resentment and jealousy blossomed into bloodshed and rape and murder. Once the sword was drawn, there was no turning back, for blood called for blood, and vengeance followed swift on the heels of atrocity. Techutli fought with Xotalanc, and Tolkemec aided first one and then the other, betraying each faction as it fitted his purposes. Techutli and his people withdrew into the quarter of the western gate, where we now sit. Zuchotl is built in the shape of an oval. Techutli, which took its name from its prince, occupies the western end of the oval. The people blocked up all doors connecting the quarter with the rest of the city, except one on each floor, which could be defended easily. They went into the pits below the city and built a wall cutting off the western end of the catacombs, where lie the bodies of the ancient Zohotlans and of those Tlazitlans slain in the feud. They dwelt as in a besieged castle, making sorties and forays on their enemies. The people of Xotalanc likewise fortified the eastern quarter of the city, and Tolkemec did likewise with the quarter by the southern gate. The central part of the city was left bare and uninhabited. Those empty halls and chambers became a battleground and a reign of brooding terror. Tolkemec warred on both clans. He was a fiend in the form of a human, worse than Xotalanc. He knew many secrets of the city he never told the others. From the crypts of the catacombs, he plundered the dead of their grisly secrets, secrets of ancient kings and wizards, long forgotten by the degenerate Zohotlans our ancestors slew. But all his magic did not aid him the night we of Tecuhtli stormed his castle and butchered all his people. Tolkemec we tortured for many days. His voice sank to a caressing slur, and a faraway look grew in his eyes, as if he looked back over the years to a scene which caused him intense pleasure. Aye, we kept a life in him until he screamed for death as for a bride. At last we took him living from the torture chamber and cast him into a dungeon for the rats to gnaw as he died. From that dungeon somehow he managed to escape and dragged himself into the catacombs. There without doubt he died, for the only way out of the catacombs beneath Tecuhtli is through Tecuhtli, and he never emerged by that way. His bones were never found, and the superstitious among our people swear that his ghost haunts the crypts to this day, wailing among the bones of the dead. 12 years ago we butchered the people of Tolkemec, but the feud raged on between Tecuhtli and Xotalanc, and it will rage until the last man, the last woman is dead. It was 50 years ago that Tecuhtli stole the wife of Xotalanc. Half a century the feud has endured. I was born in it. All in this chamber, except Askella, were born in it. We expect to die in it. We are a dying race, even as were those Zohotlans our ancestors slew. When the feud began, there were hundreds in each faction. Now we of Tecuhtli number only these you see before you, and the men who guard the 4 doors, 14 all. How many Xotalancs there are, we do not know, but I doubt if they are much more numerous than we. For 15 years no children have been born to us, and we have seen none among the Xotalancs. We are dying, but before we die we will slay as many of the men of Xotalanc as the gods permit. And with his weird eyes blazing, Olmec spoke long of that grisly feud, fought out in silent chambers and dim halls under the blaze of the green fire jewels, on floors smouldering with the flames of hell and splashed with deeper crimson from severed veins. In that long butchery a whole generation had perished. Xotalanc was dead long ago, slain in a grim battle on an ivory stair. Tecuhtli was dead, flayed alive by the maddened Xotalancs who had captured him. Without emotion, Olmec told of hideous battles fought in black corridors, of ambushes on twisting stairs and red butcheries. With a redder, more abysmal gleam in his deep dark eyes, he told of men and women flayed alive, mutilated and dismembered, of captives howling under tortures so ghastly that even the barbarous Cimmerian grunted. No wonder Techotlal had trembled with the terror of capture. Yet he had gone forth to slay if he could, driven by hate that was stronger than his fear. Olmec spoke further of dark and mysterious matters, of black magic and wizardry conjured out of the black night of the catacombs, of weird creatures invoked out of darkness for horrible allies. In these things the Xotalangs had the advantage, for it was in the eastern catacombs where lay the bones of the greatest wizards of the ancient Xotlans, with their immemorial secrets. Valeria listened with morbid fascination. The feud had become a terrible elemental power, driving the people of Xochotl inexorably on to doom and extinction. It filled their whole lives. They were born in it, and they expected to die in it. They never left their barricaded castle except to steal forth into the halls of silence that lay between the opposing fortresses, to slay and be slain. Sometimes the raiders returned with frantic captives, or with grim tokens of victory in fight. Sometimes they did not return at all, or returned only as severed limbs cast down before the bolted bronze doors. It was a ghastly, unreal nightmare existence these people lived, shut off from the rest of the world, caught together like rabid rats in the same trap, butchering one another through the years, crouching and creeping through the sunless corridors to maim and torture and murder. While Olmec talked, Valeria felt the blazing eyes of Tuscala fixed upon her. The princess seemed not to hear what Olmec was saying. Her expression, as he narrated victories or defeats, did not mirror the wild rage or fiendish exultation that alternated on the face of the other Techotli. The feud that was an obsession to her clansmen seemed meaningless to her. Valeria found her indifferent callousness more repugnant than Olmec's naked ferocity. "And we can never leave this city," said Olmec. "For 50 years no one has left it except those—" Again he checked himself. "Even without the peril of the dragons," he continued, "we who were born and raised in the city would not dare leave it. We have never set foot outside the walls. We are not accustomed to the open sky and the naked sun. No, we were born in Xochotl, and in Xochotl we shall die."
"Well," said Conan, "with your leave, we'll take our chances with the dragons. This feud is none of our business. If you'll show us to the west gate, we'll be on our way."
Tuscalus' hands clenched, and she started to speak, but Olmec interrupted her. "It is nearly nightfall. If you wander forth into the plain by night, you will certainly fall prey to the dragons."
"We crossed it last night, and slept in the open without seeing any,"
returned Conan. Tuscala smiled mirthlessly.
"You dare not leave Xochotl?"
Conan glared at her with instinctive antagonism. She was not looking at him, but at the woman opposite him. "I think they dare," stated Olmec. "But look you, Conan and Valeria, the gods must have sent you to us to cast victory into the laps of the Tecuhtli. You are professional fighters. Why not fight for us? We have wealth in abundance. Precious jewels are as common in Xochotl as cobblestones are in the cities of the world. Some the Xochotlans brought with them from Kosala. Some, like the firestones they found in the hills to the east. Aid us to wipe out the Xotalangs, and we will give you all the jewels you can carry."
"And will you help us destroy the dragons?"
asked Valeria.
"With bows and poisoned arrows, 30 men could slay all the dragons in the forest."
"Aye," replied Olmec promptly. "We have forgotten the use of the bow in years of hand-to-hand fighting, but we can learn again."
What do you say?
Valeria inquired of Conan.
We are both penniless vagabonds.
He grinned hardly.
I'd as soon kill Xotalanx as anybody.
"Then you agree?" exclaimed Olmec, while Teotl fairly hugged himself with delight.
I now suppose you show us chambers where we can sleep, as we can be fresh tomorrow for the beginning of the slaying.
Olmec nodded and waved a hand, and Teotl and a woman led the adventurers into a corridor which led through a door off to the left of the jade dais. A glance back showed Valeria Olmec sitting on his throne, chin on knotted fist, staring after them. His eyes burned with a weird flame. Taskela leaned back in her seat, whispering to the sullen-faced maid Yasala, who leaned over her shoulder, her ear to the princess's moving lips. The hallway was not so broad as most they had traversed, but it was long. Presently the woman halted, opened the door, and drew aside for Valeria to enter.
Wait a minute,
growled Conan.
Where do I sleep?
Teotl pointed to a chamber across the hallway, but one door farther down. Conan hesitated and seemed inclined to raise an objection, but Valeria smiled spitefully at him and shut the door in his face. He muttered something uncomplimentary about women in general and strode off down the corridor after Teotl. In the ornate chamber where he was to sleep, he glanced up at the slot-like skylights. Some were wide enough to admit the body of a slender man, supposing the glass were broken.
Why don't the Xotalanx come over the roofs and shatter those skylights?
He asked.
They cannot be broken, answered Teotl. Besides, the roofs would be hard to clamber over. They are mostly spires and domes and steep ridges.
He volunteered more information about the castle of Tecuhtli. Like the rest of the city, it contained 4 stories, or tiers of chambers with towers jutting up from the roof. Each tier was named. Indeed, the people of Xuchotl had a name for each chamber, hall and stair in the city, as people of more normal cities designate streets and quarters. In Tecuhtli, the floors were named the Eagle's tier, the Ape's tier, the Tiger's tier, and the Serpent's tier, in the order as enumerated, the Eagle's tier being the highest or 4th floor.
Who is Taskela?
asked Conan.
Olmec's wife.
Teotl shuddered and glanced furtively about him before answering.
No, she is Taskela. She was the wife of Xotalanx, the woman Tecuhtli stole to start the feud. What are you talking about? Demanded Conan. That woman is beautiful and young. Are you trying to tell me that she was a wife 50 years ago? Why, I swear it. She was a full-grown woman when the Tlazitlans journeyed from Lake Zuad. It was because the king of Stygia desired her for a concubine that Xotalanx and his brother rebelled and fled into the wilderness. She is a witch who possesses the secret of perpetual youth. What's that?
asked Conan. Teotl shuddered again.
Ask me not. I dare not speak. It is too grisly, even for Xuchotl.
And touching his finger to his lips, he glided from the chamber. Chapter 4 Scent of Black Lotus. Valeria unbuckled her sword belt and laid it with a sheathed weapon on the couch where she meant to sleep. She noted that the doors were supplied with bolts and asked where they led.
Those lead to adjoining chambers,
answered the woman, indicating the doors on the right and left.
That one,
pointing to a copper-bound door opposite that which opened into the corridor,
leads to a corridor which runs to a stair that descends into the catacombs. But do not fear, naught can harm you here. Who spoke of fear?
snapped Valeria. "I'd just like to know what sort of harbor I'm dropping anchor in. No, I don't want you to sleep at the foot of my couch. I'm not accustomed to being waited on, not by women anyway. You have my leave to go." Alone in the room, the pirate shut the bolts on all the doors, kicked off her boots, and stretched luxuriously out on the couch. She imagined Conan similarly situated across the corridor, but her feminine vanity prompted her to visualize him as scowling and muttering with chagrin as he cast himself on his solitary couch, and she grinned with gleeful malice as she prepared herself for slumber. Outside, night had fallen. In the halls of Zuchotl, the green fire jewels blazed like the eyes of prehistoric cats. Somewhere among the dark towers, a night wind moaned like a restless spirit. Through the dim passages, stealthy figures began stealing like disembodied shadows. Valeria awoke suddenly on her couch. In the dusky emerald glow of the fire gems, she saw a shadowy figure bending over her. For a bemused instant, the apparition seemed part of the dream she had been dreaming. She had seemed to lie on the couch in the chamber as she was actually lying, while over her pulsed and throbbed a gigantic black blossom so enormous that it hid the ceiling. Its exotic perfume pervaded her being, inducing a delicious, sensuous languor that was something more and less than sleep. She was sinking into scented billows of insensible bliss when something touched her face. So supersensitive were her drugged senses that the light touch was like a dislocating impact, jolting her rudely into full wakefulness. Then it was that she saw not a gargantuan blossom, but a dark-skinned woman standing over her. With the realization came anger and instant action. The woman turned lively, but before she could run, Valeria was on her feet and had caught her arm. She fought like a wildcat for an instant, and then subsided as she felt herself crushed by the superior strength of her captor. The pirate wrenched the woman around to face her, caught her chin with her free hand, and forced her captive to meet her gaze. It was the sullen Yasala, Taskelas's maid. "What the devil were you doing bending over me? What's that in your hand?" The woman made no reply, but sought to cast away the object. Valeria twisted her arm around in front of her, and the thing fell to the floor. A great black exotic blossom on a jade green stem, large as a woman's head, to be sure, but tiny beside the exaggerated vision she had seen. "The Black Lotus," said Valeria between her teeth. "The blossom whose scent brings deep sleep. You were trying to drug me. If you hadn't accidentally touched my face with the petals, you'd have. Why did you do it? What's your game?" Yasala maintained a sulky silence, and with an oath Valeria whirled her around, forced her to her knees, and twisted her arm up behind her back. "Tell me, or I'll tear your arm out of its socket." Yasala squirmed in anguish as her arm was forced excruciatingly up between her shoulder blades, but a violent shaking of her head was the only answer she made. "Slut!" Valeria cast her from her to sprawl on the floor. The pirate glared at the prostrate figure with blazing eyes. Fear and the memory of Taskelas's burning eyes stirred in her, rousing all her tigerish instincts of self-preservation. These people were decadent. Any sort of perversity might be expected to be encountered among them. But Valeria sensed here something that moved behind the scenes, some secret terror fouler than common degeneracy. Fear and revulsion of this weird city swept her. These people were neither sane nor normal. She began to doubt if they were even human. Madness smoldered in the eyes of them all except the cruel, cryptic eyes of Taskela, which held secrets and mysteries more abysmal than madness. She lifted her head and listened intently. The halls of Zuchotl were as silent as if it were in reality a dead city. The green jewels bathed the chamber in a nightmare glow, in which the eyes of the woman on the floor glittered eerily up at her. A thrill of panic throbbed through Valeria, driving the last vestige of mercy from her fierce soul.
"Why did you try to drug me?"
she muttered, grasping the woman's black hair and forcing her head back to glare into her sullen, long-lashed eyes.
"Did Tascala send you?"
No answer. Valeria cursed venomously and slapped the woman first on one cheek and then the other. The blows resounded through the room, but Yasala made no outcry.
"Why don't you scream?"
demanded Valeria savagely.
"Do you fear someone will hear you? Whom do you fear? Tascala? Olmec? Conan?"
Yasala made no reply. She crouched, watching her captor with eyes baleful as those of a basilisk. Stubborn silence always fends anger. Valeria turned and tore a handful of cords from a nearby hanging.
"You sulky slut,"
she said between her teeth.
"I'm going to strip you stark naked and tie you across that couch and whip you until you tell me what you were doing here and who sent you."
Yasala made no verbal protest, nor did she offer any resistance, as Valeria carried out the first part of her threat with a fury that her captive's obstinacy only sharpened. Then for a space there was no sound in the chamber except the whistle and crackle of hard-woven silken cords on naked flesh. Yasala could not move her fast-bound hands or feet. Her body writhed and quivered under the chastisement. Her head swayed from side to side in rhythm with the blows. Her teeth were sunk into her lower lip, and a trickle of blood began as the punishment continued. But she did not cry out. The pliant cords made no great sound as they encountered the quivering body of the captive. Only a sharp crackling snap, but each cord left a red streak across Yasala's dark flesh. Valeria inflicted the punishment with all the strength of her war-hardened arm, with all the mercilessness acquired during a life where pain and torment were daily happenings, and with all the cynical ingenuity which only a woman displays towards a woman. Yasala suffered more physically and mentally than she would have suffered under a lash wielded by a man, however strong. It was the application of this feminine cynicism which at last tamed Yasala. A low whimper escaped from her lips, and Valeria paused, arm lifted, and raked back a damp yellow lock.
"Well, are you going to talk?"
she demanded.
"I can keep this up all night, if necessary."
"Merci," whispered the woman. "I will tell." Valeria cut the cords from her wrists and ankles and pulled her to her feet. Yasala sank down on the couch, half reclining on one bare hip, supporting herself on her arm, and writhing at the contact of her smarting flesh with the couch. She was trembling in every limb.
"Wine,"
she begged, dry-lipped, indicating with a quivering hand a gold vessel on an ivory table.
"Let me drink. I am weak with pain. Then I will tell you all."
Valeria picked up the vessel, and Yasala rose unsteadily to receive it. She took it, raised it toward her lips, then dashed the contents full into the Aquilonian's face. Valeria reeled backward, shaking and clawing the stinging liquid out of her eyes. Through a smarting mist, she saw Yasala dart across the room, fling back a bolt, throw open the copper-bound door, and run down the hall. The pirate was after her instantly, sword out and murder in her heart. But Yasala had the start, and she ran with the nervous agility of a woman who has just been whipped to the point of hysterical frenzy. She rounded a corner in the corridor, yards ahead of Valeria, and when the pirate turned it, she saw only an empty hole, and at the other end a door that gaped blackly. A damp, moldy scent reeked up from it, and Valeria shivered. That must be the door that led to the catacombs. Yasala had taken refuge among the dead. Valeria advanced to the door and looked down a flight of stone steps that vanished quickly into utter blackness. Evidently, it was a shaft that led straight to the pits below the city, without opening upon any of the lower floors. She shivered slightly at the thought of the thousands of corpses lying in their stone crypts down there, wrapped in their mouldering cloths. She had no intention of groping her way down those stone steps. Yasala doubtless knew every turn and twist of the subterranean tunnels. She was turning back, baffled and furious, when a sobbing cry welled up from the blackness. It seemed to come from a great depth, but human words were faintly distinguishable, and the voice was that of a woman.
"Oh, help! Help in Set's name! Ah!"
It trailed away, and Valeria thought she caught the echo of ghostly tittering. Valeria felt her skin crawl. What had happened to Yasala down there in the thick blackness? There was no doubt that it had been she who had cried out, but what peril could have befallen her? Was Xotalanca lurking down there? Olmec had assured them that the catacombs below Tekochtli were walled off from the rest, too securely for their enemies to break through. Besides, that tittering had not sounded like a human being at all. Valeria hurried back down the corridor, not stopping to close the door that opened on the stair. Regaining her chamber, she closed the door and shut the bolt behind her. She pulled on her boots and buckled her sword belt about her. She was determined to make her way to Conan's room and urge him, if he still lived, to join her in an attempt to fight their way out of that city of devils. But even as she reached the door that opened into the corridor, a long drawn scream of agony rang through the halls, followed by the stamp of running feet and the loud clangor of swords.